They are not there upholding their constitutional oaths, and in fact, they are trashing them. And when you actually look at some of the very cold, I would say Marxist beliefs behind these people that seem to animate them, they are deceiving us as to who they really are, and they are trying to enact their own visions of what the polity should be, irrespective of these oaths and irrespective of the people's will.
Is it possible that communist ideology has infiltrated America's intelligence agencies? After looking into key figures involved in the Spygate scandal, what information did Diana West uncover about their beliefs? And how is Donald Trump a counter-revolutionary president in West's view? This is American Thought Leaders, and I'm Jan Jekielek. In this episode, we'll sit down with Diana West, a journalist and author of The Red Thread, a search for ideological drivers inside the anti-Trump conspiracy. Diana West, wonderful to have you on American Thought Leaders.
Oh, wonderful to be here, Jan.
What motivated you to try to find this sort of common ideological thread? How did this happen?
Well, that's a really good question, because there was one thing, and it had to do with looking at the behaviors, the actions we were starting to learn about, say, a couple of years ago, on the part of these senior officials in Washington, that certainly, it may be argued, some of them are seditious. I mean, really serious actions against the rule of law in their efforts to take down this presidency, the campaign, undermine the transition, and it's just gone on. And I was just trying to get a sense of why they were so angry, why they were taking resorting to these measures when America is known for the peaceful transition of power.
Right.
And normally when one party goes out of power, the other party comes in, and the one that's out of power starts building their campaign for next time, and the power will change every 2 to 4 years, 6 years, 8 years at the most, but the pendulum swings. Right. And normally these kinds of people will just wait till next time. And so we didn't see that. We saw all kinds of plotting going on that we were learning about, all kinds of just absolutely terrifying uses of our security agencies, the FBI, the CIA, and so on. So I'd wondered, who are these people? Why are they doing this? Why are they risking everything? Because of course, if they are caught, and this is still an open question,
yes,
if they are caught, they can lose everything, including their freedom, including certainly their pensions, including their reputation. So what was driving them? This was not normal American behavior. And this becomes a very difficult question to answer when you're looking at career public officials, people who have tremendous resumes. They head the FBI, they head the CIA, they work in the Justice Department. You really can't get very far outside of their public persona. In 2017, it was actually December, we had a real break in the whole story, and that was by James Rosen, who was then with Fox News, and he wrote about this very interesting couple, Bruce and Nellie Ohr. Bruce Ohr being the high-ranking Justice Department official who was a liaison between Christopher Steele and the justice world,
yes,
as we learned. And his wife Nellie, who worked for Glenn Simpson at Fusion GPS, the shop that created the Steele dossier. Well, Nellie, it turned out, had been an academic. She was a professor in the 1990s, and that meant that there were going to be writings, publicly available writings, book reviews, for example, a PhD thesis, and so on, that I could at least look at to try to get a better sense of who she is. And indeed, it turns out she is a Russia expert. She speaks the language. She taught the subject. She got a PhD in it, in history, at Stanford after Harvard. And she studied in the Soviet Union when it was still the Soviet Union. And I ended up putting together in The Red Thread kind of an ideological profile of Nellie Ohr. She's my first case, in which I did learn that she had a very soft spot, believe it or not, for the regime of Joseph Stalin.
Fascinating.
Terrifying. But it is something where she talked about kind of on the one hand and on the other hand. In other words, she would talk about the terror, this is a quote, the terror and excitement of the Stalin era. She was talking about the frustration in a book review of trying to teach about this era to her students at Vassar in the 1990s. Terror, I can understand. Excitement. So you look a little further and you find that she similarly applauded Stalin for trying to build a legal structure. This is what she called the agonizing paradox of Stalin's era, trying to build a legal structure on the one hand and yet executing innocent civilians on the other hand. I mean, this is the kind of attitude, it's kind of a moral equivalent attitude, really, when you're looking at this bloodthirsty regime that killed millions and millions of people. The legal structure was a sham if you're executing innocent civilians, of course, but this was very clearly a theme of her writings, and indeed including in her PhD thesis. And I learned that she followed a school of history in American academia known as revisionism. It is a revisionism. There have been a number, but it was one that came about in the 60s and 70s that was essentially promoted by straight-up Marxists and the New Left, what we used to call the New Left in this country, which really wasn't much different from the Old Left. It was usually their children. But they took over, really, the departments on the college campuses. And they are a school that writes about itself and has its stars and so on. And she very clearly followed in this school. Those people are the people she thanks, who are essentially her mentors, people she studied at Harvard and so on. So it became pretty clear that there was a red thread, if you will, here in terms of a openness to communist ideology as it was put into practice.
And a willingness
in the
to
Soviet
see
Union.
someone like Stalin, who we know his history, extremely well in this sort of positive, apologetic light.
Yes, shocking.
Yeah,
absolutely
fascinating.
shocking.
I mean,
so she was sort of case number one, and it goes on from there. But that kind of gives you a flavor of what I was finding with Nellie Ohr. It always intrigued me. She does have a CIA credential. She worked for their open source shop. So we know she had a CIA connection, interesting. We also know that she took out a ham radio operator's license in the spring of 2016.
oh, right. So you're thinking, who's she talking to?
Who's she talking to?
Yeah.
We don't know the answers to these questions, but she becomes a very interesting figure and very important in this entire
Extremely,
movement.
for multiple reasons, right? I mean, if you believe Lee Smith, she's very instrumental, actually, in the creation of the Steele dossier in the first place. And now that we have, the IG report that has come out fairly recently, it's auspicious that we're having this interview. So we know a lot more about how, let's say, wrong or false the Steele dossier was through and through.
Garbage. Right.
That's a good word, right?
It's been used.
So you also looked at Christopher Steele in the book.
Yes.
So what did you find? I mean, I know a little bit, but tell me.
Yes. Well, he seemed like the next person to try to crack a little bit into the shell of, because essentially if she had a little CIA connection, which has not really been fully disclosed, in other words, you don't really know if she knows John Brennan from her past or what have you, another person in this group. Christopher Steele, as a former intelligence officer for the British, is almost her opposite number at Fusion GPS, and it's his name obviously on the dossier. And there's very little about him as an intelligence officer, given that is not a very public profession.
Yes, of course.
But when he burst on the scene, the British press were looking at him, and one of the first things that came out, he was a very prominent student at Cambridge in the 1980s. Around the same age as Nellie Ohr, also graduated in the 1980s. And Christopher Steele was the head of the very storied Cambridge Debating Society, the Cambridge Union. I believe at the same time, the new Prime Minister Boris Johnson was the head of the Oxford Union.
Okay.
So you see the kind of people these are. And when Christopher Steele was this prominent Cambridge student, he was known, and this is in a history of the Cambridge Union, he was known as a confirmed socialist.
Wow.
Right. Exactly. And when you look at that was twinned with some reporting by the Daily Mail that stated that he was also somebody who had CND credentials. CND Goes back to that same period. CND was Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. Right. It was essentially a Marxist front group that was very much in sync with Soviet Union foreign policy goals to remove American nuclear weapons from Europe. And they were riddled with actual Marxists. Some think there was also support from the Soviet Union of the whole group. Certainly that also included a number of very sincere, peaceable people who were hoping to do right by the world. But this would be a place where Christopher Steele had some involvement. We don't know the extent of it. But interesting, because it certainly is a hard left type of credential. And the fact that he left Cambridge and was hired then by MI6 and then posted in Moscow with these kinds of politics is just another one of these shocking happenings that we're seeing replicated everywhere, which tells you a lot about MI6. You would think they might have learned. They had a number of Soviet agents out of Cambridge, the very famous Cambridge Five, yes, for example. So you'd think they'd be more careful, but what is their culture? We can learn a little bit about that from this kind of a hire. Christopher Steele also was known to others with, very edgy in terms of his politics. He has the distinction of bringing in the first PLO representative to the Cambridge Union. And this was a time when the United States and Israel still considered the Palestinian movement to be a terrorist organization, officially. So this was a big deal at that time to essentially normalize that particular group with that kind of a very prestigious invitation. So you see where his politics are. I always wondered, given when Donald Trump burst on the scene in the spring of 2016 with his foreign policy speech, he spoke specifically about essentially revamping Americans' nuclear arsenal.
Yes.
I also wondered if that perhaps might have given Christopher Steele added reason to try to oppose him. We don't know where Christopher Steele's politics are on that particular point, but given his animus against Donald Trump, I wouldn't be surprised to learn that he still had those same feelings.
When reading the book,
yeah,
there's all these kind of specific items of information that you've managed to dig out. It's remarkable, and you get this kind of feeling of there is this just kind of dominating ideology here, and it's a left ideology, right? This is, I think, what you're showing.
Yes.
And this particularly comes out in someone who's actually been in the news again, front and center. Of course, the former director of the FBI,
yes,
Mr. Comey.
Yes.
And that what you found around Comey is, again, fascinating. I mean, there's some of it is known, and some of it is, I guess, less known. I mean,
yes,
can you
sure,
expand a little bit here? Because
yes,
I think this seems like one of the deepest dives you do, right?
Yes, well, yeah, thanks to Comey's own writings and
right,
public statements, because all of this is open source, obviously, and it's mainly their own words that I'm looking at, or reports about them. So I think that one way to think of them helpfully is really anti-democratic, small d, anti-democratic, anti-election, anti the people. I mean, this is the great irony of the left, I suppose.
But
when we look
well-meaning? I mean, this is...
I don't know. I
okay,
can't really speak to intent.
Okay.
Certainly there are well-meaning people in this same general movement, of course. Mm-hmm. But in terms of intent by James Comey, I couldn't speak to it. I have to sort of look at, for this exercise, I'm just looking at trying to understand what he believes. And the first clue comes from an interview he gave in 2003. And this was with New York Magazine, and he was just about to be elevated he was working in the Southern District of New York as a federal prosecutor, and he was just about to be elevated to be the #2 man at the Justice Department under George W. Bush.
Okay.
John Ashcroft was the Attorney General. And the New York Magazine writer thought it was a very strange pairing because Comey, even though he was considered to be a Republican, was kind of an edgy punk rock type, whereas John Ashcroft was known as a very, conservative, yes, Christian, constitutional.
Very Christian.
Very, yes, yeah. And criticized for this, and by the media, I should say. But Comey was telling this reporter, kind of a giddy interview, and I suspect because he knew he was going to be getting this phone call confirming his appointment, the reporter thought he was just laughing all the time, and maybe because he was about to join this rarefied ranks of power in the Justice Department. But anyway, he told the reporter that when he was in college, he had been a communist, and that he didn't really know what his politics were. This would be about 20 years later. But whatever they were, he was different, I suppose, but he hadn't really figured it out yet, which I thought was an interesting statement. Not exactly a fire-breathing anti-communist, to be sure, but leave it there. So I thought, well, what can we learn about the period where he was a communist? And William and Mary, his alma mater, has posted online, very helpfully, their senior papers by their students.
Okay.
And so I was able to find John Comey's senior thesis, which was about his lifelong mentor. This is somebody very important to him to this day. The theologian Reinhold Niebuhr, and Jerry Falwell was the other subject of this paper, Jerry Falwell being the leader, the founder of the Moral Majority. And Comey was juxtaposing their views of the Christian in politics.
Okay.
So it's an interesting paper. And Jerry Falwell's view was that you should take Christian morality into the political realm and follow the Ten Commandments, basically. And Reinhold Niebuhr was that you should ditch your Christian teachings and work for his definition of justice, which was essentially a very coercive redistribution of power and wealth, which sounds very Marxist.
Yes.
Well, Reinhold Niebuhr was very Marxist. So it would appeal to a young James Comey, the communist. Reinhold Niebuhr was somebody who was a member of the Socialist Party. He lobbied very heavily for the United States to recognize the Soviet Union in the 1930s. He belonged to numerous communist front groups, judged that way by the Attorney General under Roosevelt. These were official communist front groups, according to the Attorney General. And Reinhold Niebuhr had very high-ranking positions with them. In that period, he actually advocated the use of force to change our social order. There's a headline I found from the 1930s where he'd gone to a college campus. This is Reinhold Niebuhr. And the reason I even bring this up is this was not just a youthful flirtation of James Comey, because Comey, to this day, when he's asked who his influences are, the very first one is Reinhold Niebuhr.
Right.
He even notes the first two books that were most important to him coming from this same most militant period of Niebuhr's life, the 1930s, where Niebuhr really was talking about revolution as a possibility, possibly justified. And the kinds of things that Comey writes about in his thesis are chilling in light of his rising to the heights of our justice system and the FBI.
Right.
He basically says that that there are times when an evil action, this is a paraphrase but very close, an action may be evil but not necessarily immoral, given the circumstances. So this is where you start to see Comey, the actor who will, for example, decide not to take it on himself to even take the role of the Attorney General to decide not to indict Hillary Clinton, for example, out of the circumstances. I mean, this is where you start seeing the ends justify the means, the notion that he knows what the higher good is.
Okay.
He talks about again, distilling Niebuhr, that the Christian in politics must leave his Christian beliefs when he is actually acting in politics and must be willing to sin in the name of justice. This is another one of Comey's beliefs from this senior thesis. And again, we might say, well, he's 22 years old. However, this Niebuhr affinity still is something he is the first to tell you about. So I think it's valid to explore Niebuhr's beliefs, and also the fact that Niebuhr taught Comey's professor at William and Mary,
right,
as did a Frankfurt School member that Niebuhr taught with, Paul Tillich. That becomes interesting when you're doing this sort of notion of a red thread, when you look at a very young Hillary Clinton, who really was, we might say, radicalized in her youth by her youth minister, her Methodist youth ministry. It's a well-known story that I think Barbara Olson first wrote about years ago. And this youth minister by the name of Jones was assigning his charges Reinhold Niebuhr and Paul Tillich. So we're seeing the same influences.
Same intellectual influences.
Same intellectual influences. And this is essentially what the book tries to do, is to try to go where intellectual biography lies. Because I think we miss a lot when we don't study the motivations and study the influences on these very important people whose policymaking reflect these early and very serious, these are serious people. Comey, Clinton, and so on.
Top of the power structure in America.
Right, and they share these same kinds of early formative influences and carry them through, I believe, to this day. I think you can certainly make that case.
So you have this really interesting chapter in your book. I think it's a bouquet for Putin.
Yes.
Tell me about what you found with respect in this chapter.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, that particular chapter refers to a quotation from Nancy Pelosi, who actually was criticizing at that moment, about to be released, 4-page memo from Devin Nunes's Intelligence Committee.
What's known as the Nunes memo now.
Yes, the Nunes memo, 4 pages. And I will just never forget living through that period. This would have been early 2018. And this was a matter for Donald Trump to decide. It was classified, this particular memo. And the furor in Washington, I'm not even sure if impeachment equals it. It was that over the top, just because this was one document. And you heard from Nancy Pelosi, you heard from John McCain, you heard from all of Never Trump, all of the left, all of the Democrats, all of the punditocracy, if you will, on cable news, railing against the possible release of this particular document as the end of the Republic, not just the end of the Republic, but something that would aid Vladimir Putin, that could only help Vladimir Putin. And this is when you saw this notion that the FBI and the Justice Department and the CIA were untouchable and could not be criticized, which was a fascinating switch coming from the left, where if we go back a couple of decades, they were always fighting the FBI and the CIA and these power structures.
And it's also the role of media, ostensibly, to
fight the institutions of power. Exactly.
Right.
It's so true. And now they were essentially their spokesmen and women for secrecy, for preventing the people from making up our own mind, for reading this memo that was, created on our dime, and in order to get to the bottom of what was going on by our duly elected officials. And you even had John McCain begging for Robert Mueller to be the only real official looking at this, and actually calling for elected officials to stop looking at all of these things through the lens of politics, as if getting to the bottom of it was only a political type of, he called it a partisan sideshow, which is truly stunning, because when it was released, and this was Donald Trump's declassification, it comes out, we all could not wait to read it. I mean, it was probably even more than any of these giant reports. It was the big news. 4 succinct pages, and we got the whole thing. We got the entire mechanism by which the FBI and the Justice Department subverted the process by which they would seek a warrant from the FISA court to spy on Carter Page and the wider Trump campaign. It's all in that memo. The relationship of Bruce and Nellie Ohr, Christopher Steele, the creation of the dossier, the mechanism after Christopher Steele was no longer working with the FBI, how he continued to work through the Ohrs and so on. It's all in there in 4 pages. And I looked at the giant FISA report, which recently came out from the IG, which I don't pretend to have read it all yet, but I looked at it, and basically it's a giant elaboration on what came out of that 4-page memo. When you realize that the Nunes memo was vindicated in every particular, and you look back at this group of politicians, of media, the various officials inside the Justice Department who were preventing this from being declassified. It's a presidential order that declassified it. You have to start wondering what they believe, what their purpose was in preventing the people from seeing this truly chilling information about the abuse of the security state. And I think that our only conclusion has to be is that they are against the people knowing what they're doing. They're against the democratic process, truly. They're against the duly elected officials carrying out their constitutional responsibilities, and their allegiance is to the security state. And that is a chilling proposition, but I really believe it's one we have to face. So when we get to this notion that the FBI made 17 errors.
Yes.
Errors. And that they made sloppiness, according to James Comey. He was wrong, they were sloppy. I mean, this becomes laughable, and you really wonder, how dumb do they think we are? I mean, you have to connect it to this effort to save their perfidy from exposure. And one thing I learned, I wrote an earlier book called American Betrayal, and I learned no longer to see the world, really, these conflicts between the free world and the communist world, or Democrat and Republican. I learned to look at things between who wants to bring things into the open and who is trying to cover them up. And you no longer see party divisions. You no longer even see divisions in terms of free world, communist world. There are people who want the truth to come out and let the people decide, and there are those that wish to withhold it from the people and never let the people have a role.
So it's very interesting. Makes me think of a couple of things. One is, Glenn Greenwald, who's been one of the people that's been following this whole, let's call it the Russia collusion hoax. I think we can call it that fairly.
Sure.
It's a lot less
Capital
debatable
letters.
than it was even, a few months ago. And
Sure.
Honestly, very obviously has very left-wing politics, but is absolutely anti-secrecy
Right.
in his
Me too.
ideological respect. So it's interesting how, exactly what you're saying, that there's this sort of commonality around, there's more conservative and more liberal folks that are all, let's say, anti-secrecy and want
Right.
disclosure irrespective of where it falls, because that's
Right.
what's important.
It
Versus
is.
this, people on both sides of the aisle, so to speak, very happy to keep things under wraps
Yes.
for whatever reason.
Yes, generally having to do with
Yeah.
preserving power.
Okay.
And well, I think that's true, and because information, controlling information. I mean, this goes certainly to to Orwell, and the notion of controlling the narrative. He talked about controlling the present to control the past, and controlling the past to control
Right.
the future. Very famously, it's really true, and this is something that above politics and above this particular horrendous episode in our history. This is about control of what we know and what we believe and how we can be manipulated based on those things.
The other thing that really struck me with what
Yeah.
you said, I think it reminded me of something Horowitz said in testimony, because I don't think this
Yeah.
was in the report, but he said that what he found is kind of on the spectrum, this is a paraphrase too, on one end gross negligence, on the other side intentionality. And
Yeah.
but he isn't, he's not making a judgment
Yeah.
as to where it lands. Like I think he was like, you make your judgment.
Right.
Right, but it's somewhere
As
in
we
that
should,
it's somewhere
yes.
in that realm, which is, I think actually quite a powerful statement.
It is.
When you so
It really is, and again, I think that is another reason that trying to examine what these people truly believe, what animates them to go into public life and not sell insurance or build cabinets or teach. Well, teaching actually is a very powerful profession as well in these same political terms. But what drove them to spend their careers in the corridors of power? It certainly does not. I mean, I think it's very fair to say they are not there upholding their constitutional oaths, and in fact, they are trashing them. And when you actually look at some of the very cold, I would say Marxist beliefs behind these people that seem to animate them, they are deceiving us as to who they really are, and they are trying to enact their own visions of what the polity should be, irrespective of these oaths and irrespective of the people's will. And the arrogance on display is really only one of the manifestations of this. It's certainly something most people can see. Most people have noticed this about James Comey, for example, on both sides.
Right.
But this, what does this speak to? And it is this kind of on-fire true believer of doing, bringing love and justice as defined by Reinhold Niebuhr, which comes out of a very sort of Marxist bent, doing love and justice on the people, which requires coercion by the state. And it's frightening because these are the kinds of people who are not reined in by a traditional kind of morality. Going back to Comey's dismissal of Falwell, for example, they are unleashed by their amorality. And it's scary when they have the levers of power. This aspect of their lives is something that the media in particular and politicians shy away from. They really don't want to go there, and it interests me because, for example, I did a brief interview with Sean Hannity earlier in the year, and we did get out there that Comey had been a communist, that John Brennan had voted communist. And there wasn't much time for much more.
That's another character that
we didn't talk about Brennan.
That
right, I just dropped that in there.
Strongly, in the book, and also is openly saying he's a communist, right?
Yes, I mean, almost as a recruiting tool, because the time let me just, one thing, the point I was just going to make was these little factoids, which have so much more, to discuss as we're doing, we could go on all day. It went wild on social media after that interview. But unfortunately, there was no follow-on in terms of saying, well, what else can we learn about them? I think people are genuinely interested and want that missing X factor to explain why they made these mistakes, basically mistakes, in quotation marks. But speaking to Brennan, yes, he's another important player here. He too wrote a master's thesis, which is publicly, this would have been brought forward by, I think it was Charles Johnson, uploaded this for the Daily Caller, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay.
John Brennan's master's thesis back in the day at University of Texas. And it is not as clear. Comey's is better written. If we're looking for command and control, I don't know if that speaks to one or the other, but Comey was better writer. John Brennan, very fuzzy. I mean, you can see it in his tweets. But he wrote a paper about human rights in Egypt. And basically, he is rather favorably disposed toward redistribution of land under Nasser. And he is sort of upset about, at the time, this would have been Sadat's time when he was writing, going more toward a free market or more toward a capitalist system.
Right.
You can read that into it. But he, too, in this context, I'm not saying it's the same context, but he talks about democracy as a process. And because it's a process, there are times where you can essentially, I'm paraphrasing, you can essentially ignore due process. If you are looking at expanding democracy, again, what is the definition thereof? But not to put too fine a point on it, because he was writing about the period and Egypt, but he was also rather concerning, given his own roles and his own behaviors, if that really was his attitude at the time, and I think it was. He again saw, I believe, I would make the argument, he saw the levers of power as not things to treat with deference, but things to use. And I think that unites a number of these people that are doing things we find so terribly alarming. The more we find out about them, they are not constrained by their constitutional constraints. They are emboldened by their power.
So, Diana, there's this moment in the book that you describe where Brennan is going to do his polygraph, basically, and to, he's applying for work, I believe, at the CIA, right? Or is it? Okay, so
absolutely, it's just before his admission. He was moving along the job process, and this is actually Brennan's story. He told this story. It's so interesting. He told this story in September 2016.
Okay.
To a group. It was essentially a diversity type conference or meeting where he, I believe, was telling the story in order to encourage leftists to apply to the CIA. He was essentially using that kind of diversity as an example of, look, I got in the CIA, you can too. I really think that was what was driving this story, because you wonder, why would he bring this up? But think of September 2016, we are assuming Hillary Clinton is going to be president. I believe he was believed to be the person who would have continued at the CIA in a Clinton administration. So you could look at it as a jobs fair pitch. And he talks about going to the, for his polygraph, his lie detector test, and having this sort of moment where he realized, I better tell the truth because the machine will record if I lie. And they said, the question becomes, do you have any association with a group that wants to overthrow the United States, something like that? And he said simply that, yes, in 1976, he voted for Gus Hall, longtime Communist Party USA leader, convicted by the Smith Act of trying to overthrow the country, went on the lam, he served time, I mean, a convicted revolutionary, basically. And John Brennan voted for him in 1976. And the thing that's interesting to me about his anecdote is he doesn't really go farther than that. In other words, he is still admitted to the CIA, having made this admission in 1980. So it isn't even, like, again, we can say, oh, well, long time, youthful, naivete. No, it's a few years later. He doesn't mention whether he was asked any other questions. In other words, did he have a follow-up question? And I mean, that becomes kind of an interesting attitude to explore at the CIA when you think of Christopher Steele, the confirmed socialist.
Yes, with MI6.
Picked up by MI6, John Brennan, a communist sympathizer, being hired by the CIA. I mean, what does that say about our organizations right then and there? Long before Barack Obama becomes president, of course. So that was essentially the anecdote. In 1980, Angela Davis was running on that ticket. A Politburo member of the American Communist Party. And the thing that was kind of shocking to me, it's just a tiny little detail, but I thought it was kind of interesting, which is John Brennan's master's thesis advisor wrote a book on revolutions. And that book was owned by Angela Davis and was in a book bag that was used to smuggle guns into the courtroom that she owned, that were used in this horrendous episode in the early 1970s when her friends, her boyfriends, were on trial on this conspiracy kidnap murder trial. And indeed, the judge was kidnapped and killed in this episode. Anyway, it's just kind of a strange happenstance that John Brennan's professor's book on revolutions was present there. These people, they do seem to sort of find each other through the generations and through the episodes. It's just a strange little detail, but that's the kind of thing you find when you start looking for whatever it's worth. We have Angela Davis speaking at the very famous Women's March after Trump's inauguration, remember? Who's proud of his daughters and wife going to that? James Comey. So we have an FBI director who thinks it's great that a march that celebrates Angela Davis has his family members there. They all voted for Hillary Clinton. I mean, these are the kinds of people who have come to the top of our security agencies, which once upon a time were actually almost in business to fight against communist subversion at home and abroad. So think about that, what that says about where the 180-degree revolution here in ideology.
What's really fascinating about the book is let's say that people's thoughts have changed a lot. Let's say these were youth. A lot of people flirted with leftism in their youth, but maybe changed their mind after I've come across countless people in this sort of realm, right?
Sure.
But what's fascinating about what comes through in the book is that there's just this persistent, maybe, like you said, authoritarian red thread. I guess that's the name.
Yeah.
Even if it shifted from maybe a more revolutionary type ideology to a more subtle, it's still very, very left leaning. Still very control oriented. Still very. That is fascinating. You have Brennan and Comey at the same time,
right,
at the top of
terrifying
these
when you think about it.
incredibly powerful agencies,
right,
that can do, anything. I mean, it's
to anyone,
yeah.
including the President of the United States. I mean,
Right.
But think about Comey in 2018, or whenever it was, this would have been 2017, speaking with pride about his family going to this march that celebrated Angela Davis, who is still exactly what she always was. She's not changed a bit. She's still trying to bring down the man, the system, still with the movement. This is her rhetoric. Right. That's current time. That's our former FBI director. So these things do persist. And what has gone is most Americans, indeed, including in our security agencies, our counterintelligence world, any concept that there can be an enemy ideology. There's no conception that such a thing should be concerning. And that, to me, is very interesting. I actually write a little bit about that, because one thing that was said when the Soviet Union went dissolved, you had many very interesting things happening. One of them was one of the top ideologists of the Soviet Union, who actually was in charge of their thinking, their understanding of America and Canada, was a man named Arbatov. Mm-hmm. And he actually did kind of a tour of America where he was discussing this notion of taking away our concept of an enemy. This is the early 90s.
Okay.
It's a really interesting concept. And, people in the context of the day saw it in terms of this supposedly joyous ending of the Cold War, which was a very deceptive moment in our time, in general terms, which we could, have another conversation about, of course. But just thinking about that thought, we don't have any concept of an enemy. Moral relativism, if you want to call it that, is so deeply imbued that there is no ideology, including voting communists, that can bar you from joining our most powerful intelligence agency, having voted communist. And when you think about that, that agency was essentially stood up to fight communism.
And rise to the top of it.
And rise to control it.
Right.
And to know all of its secrets. I mean, that man, whether he continues to have, I don't know what its status of his clearance is. I know President Trump didn't want him to continue with the clearance, but I gather he may still have it. But think about what he knows and what lots of people like him know. I mean, this is the thing. It's not just one person. This is we've had this kind of, I would call it subversion for generations. So there are hundreds, thousands of people over the generations who have replicated themselves at the Justice Department, in the CIA, now in the FBI. The FBI may have been the last to fall, I don't know. It seems like it was holding the line longer than some of the others. The swamp goes back generations, and it really speaks to this notion of these kinds of what I would call subversives, having entered the government in legions in the FDR administration after recognition of the Soviet Union. And this is something I wrote about quite a lot in American Betrayal, trying to understand this, because when you get to that post-World War II period, this is where I think you have the first real systematic attempt by the American people, by their elected representatives in both houses, the Senate, the Congress, Democrats, and Republicans, trying to understand what I think of as the swamp, the early manifestation of the swamp, this communist subversion that we saw investigated on Capitol Hill at great cost.
McCarthy.
Senator McCarthy is certainly the most famous of these investigators, but there were numerous committee heads, numerous committees looking at this. I read one account in the New York Times that actually said they were doing so many investigations they were running out of rooms because so much had gone on unattended for this really multiple administrations, Roosevelt to Truman, 16 years before anyone even started looking. And this came to us, however, this got twisted into the Red Scare, McCarthyism being the great sin of American politics. Red's under the bed. You're paranoid if you even think this is a true thing. And yet, the evidence as we know it today vindicates this effort. It was difficult. People lost their careers. They lost their lives. I mean, they lost everything. Senator McCarthy being the most famous representative of this and most successful. This will shock many viewers. He actually was quite successful in what he was trying to do, which was uncover communists and pro-communists on the federal payroll. I mean, this was not a matter of trying to stop communism or outlaw it or anything else. It was a matter of trying to keep communists off the federal payroll, particularly in sensitive installations or agencies such as the State Department, the defense world. This is what he was about, and he was demonized to a point of, destruction. And I would say that in that round, maybe 10 years or less, 5 years, the McCarthy period was very short. He was only a chairman for less than 2 years, but he had, say, 4 years when he was looking at this. The period starts maybe with 1947, 48, goes maybe to his censure a little after, less than a decade really when they were seriously on the case. They lost. The anti-communists lost. The swamp won. And I would say that we see the swamp sort of revealed by the advent of Trump, who I would argue is the most innately anti-communist president, perhaps that we've ever had. Certainly he is a colossal counter-revolutionary figure, attempting to do something that really hadn't been tried before in the fight against domestic communism, and that really was reinstating the nation state, which is the bulwark against communism. Communism being an internationalist movement, dissolving the nation state, going toward a globalist type one world government, all of those things. When you start reinstating borders, homegrown manufacturing, control over your immigration policy. I mean, the Trump agenda was counter-revolutionary because he is trying to rebuild the nation state. And that is why I think you see these people come out of the woodwork, because they'd been there for generations replicating themselves. They come out of the woodwork, hammer and tong, and doing all these outrageous, sloppy, I argue seditious things, because he represents this mortal threat to this progressive project, which really has not seen much in the way of interruption at home since it began in earnest, I would say, at the end of World War II. And I would just say, consider the global structure that we've sort of been living in for a long time. It began at the end of World War II with two very important institutions, namely the United Nations and the INF, both of which were brought into existence by two Soviet agents who worked very high in the United States government. Alger Hiss from the State Department, he's essentially a midwife of the United Nations, and he was the first Secretary General. Well, he ran the first convocation in San Francisco. And Harry Dexter White, who had risen to be number 2 in the Treasury Department under FDR. And even though Truman was warned, Truman appointed him to head this first sort of global economy institution, this first global bank. Well, that's something we don't usually think of when we talk about preserving, quote, the liberal world order that Trump was said to threaten, etc. I mean, these are facts, they're historical facts, confirmed, reconfirmed, confirmed again. And yet, again, because we shy away from this notion of ideology and the idea that we could have a mortal enemy that is ideological, that is anti-constitutional, anti-democratic, small d, we have been deprived of this notion of an enemy. And so we have just sort of moved in this direction for all these decades until Trump. So you can understand where they're coming from. They have to stop this man at all costs. And so far, thank goodness they have not.
It's very interesting. I've read in a number of sources, I've kind of gotten mixed information, and maybe you can kind of speak to this. You talk about this a little bit in the book. On one hand, Trump has been described to me by people who should know as very much a social liberal, right? Other people have said he's the most, I think the Heritage Foundation sees him as the most conservative in terms of policy, right? More than Reagan, I think. So there's a mixed bag, and but there's also this thread of him being very kind of consistent in his views over quite some time, right?
Certain things definitely consistent. I think he's evolved on the social issues. I think he has changed. certainly on things like manufacturing in America and not getting beaten up in trade deals. This is something that you can find old videos of young Trump saying the exact same thing and taking out ads in the New York Times, so on, over decades. So yes, that's consistent. The social liberal he probably was. He seems to have talked about a change in his attitude that I think is certainly borne out in his own policies as president and his rhetoric. What I found interesting when he came out so strongly as pro-life, that a number of social conservatives with Hillary worse. Yeah. I think they came out for Hillary Clinton. I can think of a number of women in sort of journalism and politics in particular who I always were struck by as social conservatives, thought they were, and with Hillary Clinton, with her extremely, very kind of free-for-all abortion policies, they went for Hillary Clinton, even though I thought they were social conservatives, with the president or candidate promising to be a very pro-life candidate, which I thought was truly staggering and kind of showed where people really are in terms of what's important to them. But to your question, yeah, there is an interesting angle that most people don't think of about Donald Trump, and it has to do with his own religious upbringing. Okay. His father, Fred, was somebody who was very went to the Crusades of Billy Graham, for example, in New York City. Donald Trump, I believe, went with him, or at least was exposed to this. He talked about watching Jerry Falwell even as a younger man growing up. And he also found for himself, and his parents followed, the Church of Norman Vincent Peale in Manhattan, Marble Collegiate, very famous pastor. Most people know him through the power of positive thinking. He was very famous for this, which was a secular kind of project. But I found when I was looking at this that Norman Vincent Peale was a very outspoken anti-communist, going back to the 30s, 40s, 50s, and indeed was pitted against the New Deal, Franklin Roosevelt's very socialist project. And Norman Vincent Peale saw Roosevelt as a very anti-constitutional figure who was seizing powers that did not belong to the president. He got involved in certain bipartisan groups that opposed this really through that same period, which is quite interesting. When you take it forward and you realize also that, going back to James Comey, we were talking about Comey's affinity for Reinhold Niebuhr, a contemporary of Norman Vincent Peale. They were at loggerheads themselves. Wow. Niebuhr being the more pro-communist person, certainly the anti-communist, as they used to call them. Peale still believing that Christianity had to oppose communism. Niebuhr actually talked about the need for Christianity to essentially appease communism. I mean, they couldn't have been more different. And then when you realize that in this generation, we have Donald Trump, who was very close to Norman Vincent Peale. He hosted his 90th birthday party for him at the Waldorf Astoria. Norman Vincent Peale married Donald Trump with in his first marriage to Ivana. He married his sister. I mean, this was a Trump-Peale relationship. The New York Times has written about the families having a bond. And then you see James Comey and his Niebuhr affinity. You see how this ideological battle follows generations. So the red thread is not really only in our own time, sort of, I see it horizontally. I mean, it goes back in the generations, and this cleavage that we're really looking at, whether the players see it that way, I think you can make the case, and I start to see it that way, is essentially the age-old battle between communism and anti-communism, between democratic elected government and dictatorship. And I would argue that these people involved in this, I call it a conspiracy, are at their essence very dictatorial. I mean, I think it's the proof is in their pudding. And when you see Trump, the populist, you see that same kind of common touch, trying to do the agenda that he sold to the American people that they voted for. I mean, this is really black and white stuff, and I hope that by examining the beliefs of the players involved, that more Americans can start to understand how serious this is and how this really does rise above a contemporary political storm. This is really playing for keeps. And I think it's that serious.
Diana West, a powerful place to finish up. Such a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you very much, Jan. A pleasure.